Hello, welcome back to Comparative Politics Lectures. We're talking about political economy and we started talking about markets, right? So let's jump to part 3. So in this section, we're asking whether markets are free, and let's look at what that means. So what is a free market? A free market usually means a market with very little government interference. Okay, so how can this play out? Usually means relative ease of entry and exit from the market, right? So it means you can enter the industry, you can start a business, you can also wrap up your business and leave, and the government has very little say. So you can also hire and fire people easily, and there's very little labor regulation. Okay, so it seems like there's very little rules. Are there any fees or taxes? If there are, that means there is some role of the government, right? So it's not completely free, but we have some regulation. So we always hear that China is a communist country and it interferes in markets, right? Whenever you hear the news about investors, US companies investing in China, they always raise the question, how safe is it to do that? Can the Chinese government interfere in the businesses, right? So it usually means that, of course, that the government decides on various levels about how businesses can function. Let's look at how the government might be regulating agriculture markets, okay? So if you're growing apples, say, the government can basically look at what the consumption patterns are, and it can do that by looking at all the data from buyers, right? Buyers and sellers, they might have data from their credit card companies, from their banks. You can get the data from retailers. So then the government can amass all that information and give you advice based on what the consumption patterns look like. So it can basically tell apple growers on a general level that the US economy is experiencing a rise in demand for apples, right? From 10,000 apples, say bushels of apples grown in 1 year to 30,000 in the next year. So it can give you an idea that the production, the demand for apples has gone up in the country. And so the farmers need to match the production, or the government has to allow imports, right? So it can also tell you where to grow. So it can look at regions that are best fit for growing apples. It can send you that information whenever a farmer wants to increase their business. It can, give you that information through some kind of association or directly, right? And how to grow. It can tell you what kind of irrigation to use, the type of soil quality you have, whether it's suitable for apple production or not, chemical inputs that you need to use, etc., right? The government can also, allocate funding, right? We mentioned that it can give grants. So the US Department of Agriculture gives grants to farmers, and in that way it directly allocates resources, right? It's giving particular farmers money in particular regions, and that's how it's saying this is where I would like the apple business to be increasing or maintained. So if you want to understand the politics of the grant making situation here, you can look at historical studies of the impact on farmers. And some people have actually found that the USDA basically had negative effect on farms owned by Black families, basically during the Jim Crow time. And basically the grants were given to white families instead of Black families. And this led to many Black farmers losing their farms and basically having to move. So it was a very bad system. So you can see that money has a direct role in the economy, but and it has an impact on the lives of people. So the government can also limit exports to countries as well as imports, right? So you think that the government will try to help, but sometimes it can create a mess as well. So you can take the example of Trump interfering a few years ago in the exports to, or basically trade with Cuba. Okay, so after many years of the trade embargo with Cuba during the Obama administration, those embargoes were lifted, right? So for a brief time, US farmers who were in Missouri were able to sell their rice exports or their excess supply of rice to Cuba because there was a demand for rice in Cuba. So this was a very good arrangement. However, they had to stop this because of the Trump administration, which basically started to, put the embargo back on Cuba. So now the farmers from Missouri can no longer export to Cuba, so they are in a bad position. So they have to find alternative markets, right? So in this way, the government can actually create problems for businesses. The government can also set minimum wages for labor, and it can affect migration of workers through immigration policies. So it can affect who you are employing. If the government suddenly puts some kind of law that restricts your ability to hire who you can hire, then it can end up destroying your business, right? The government can also limit what farmers are doing because of potential environmental problems. So if you have a watershed area in your farm, like a lake or a river runs through the farm or something, then the government basically can put a stop to your farming practices. If we see that there's a lot of chemical runs, into the water, because this causes growth of particular types of bacteria and ends up killing a lot of life in the ecosystem. So in this way, the government can play some positive roles and some negative roles in your markets, right? So the government can actually do some of the work directly, and then it can encourage these kinds of industry associations to develop, right? When the industry associations take over some of the regulation, it seems like the government is not interfering. So now we have to ask the question, to what extent are industry associations free of government interference? So in places like China, we assume that the government has a direct role in industry associations, right? And in the US, we assume that they have relative freedom, but we really should look at it, look in depth to find out what the relationship is. So one way in which the government might interfere in these associations is to encourage farmers associations to educate farmers about crops and other things, right? The government can also play a direct role in encouraging industry associations to think about the environment and protecting biodiversity. So we want to grow rice, corn, and beans and potatoes that have the highest yield, but it might have negative impact on the environment in the sense that we might be using GMO crops or something, or any kind of crops, but we're not like thinking about biodiversity. And so biodiversity is very important for protecting the overall food supply in the world. And so we have to think about those issues. Because think about the potato famine in Ireland, right? It happened basically because people were using or growing a limited number of crops, and these different varieties were the ones that got infected with the blight. So then you had a famine situation, and it resulted in many deaths. So let's stop here and we'll talk about property in the next slide.